Um, Human races are real. Race is a valid scientific category. This is a reading of an article by Ryan Falk. I'm Spencer McGrill. In this post, I'm going to argue that human races exist. Look at the most common arguments I hear in favor of race denialism and explain why ultimately I think they are mistaken. It is somewhat misleading to talk about whether or not races are quote unquote real. A race of people is just a geographically defined set of populations which in the past, if not now, lived together and bred with each other more than they bred with outsiders. Given this definition, it is obvious that races are real because it is obvious that people who descended from Africa, Europe, East Asia, etc. are real. A better question is whether or not it is useful to categorize people by race. Of course, this brings forth the question, useful for what? Well, I will argue that race is a valid scientific category and that science is in the business of predicting and explaining the world. So for race to be a valid scientific category, it needs to help us predict and explain things. Categories help us predict things when there are differences between them. If objects in one category are heavier than objects in another, then we can predict an object's weight using this categorization scheme. Categories help us explain things when knowing which category something is in will give us a clue about why that thing possesses some trait. So firstly, how do members of different races differ, if at all? Well, obviously, the races do not differ in the sense that every member of one race has some trait or gene that no member of another race has. However, they do differ in terms of what the average person from each race is like. For one, as we know, the races differ in mean skin color and various other superficial traits such as hair color and hair type, the length and density of various bones, muscular composition, etc. Perhaps less well known is that these differences do not stop at the outside of the skull. Dozens of studies going back over 100 years have shown that races differ in mean brain size, and modern technology has recently revealed that races also differ in brain shape. Racial groups also differ in the frequency of various gene variants and the rate at which they possess various diseases, including genetic diseases. As we've already discussed, differences allow for prediction. Researchers can predict someone's self-identified race with more than 95% accuracy using measures of their skull and over 99% accuracy by looking at their genome. That seems that race is pretty scientifically valid right there. Races also differ in the mean levels of income, educational attainment, intelligence test scores, and many other variables. Because the races differ in such a wide range of traits, grouping people racially might be useful to people in an equally wide range of sciences. So racial categorization can definitely help us predict things. Can it also help us explain things? Knowing someone's race can help us explain things for at least three reasons. The races evolved in different environments. The average culture within each race is different, and the people treat other and the peop and people treat others differently based on their race. For instance, knowing someone is a white may help us explain why they have light skin evolution, why they have certain diet culture, and why it is socially inappropriate for them to use the N-word, race-based treatment. So, that's my basic case. Race allows us to make predictions and to explain human differences, and thus is a valid scientific category. Now let's look at some common objections. And that's going to be most of this article is actually Ryan Folk kind of responding to not straw men, but just various people, right, that he's kind of seen throughout the years argue that race is what the sciences, or not the sciences, what the soft sciences have kind of peddled as merely a non-valid scientific category. No credible scientists believe in race. Some people believe that they do not. Some people feel that they do not have the needed expertise to judge the validity of race. So they defer to experts, and the experts tell them that race does not exist. The problem with this argument, even though the most vocal anthropologists and biologists deny race, academic surveys show that there is actually no consensus on the topic. The use of race in American biological textbooks from 1952 to 2002. Non-medical descriptions of race. 1952 to 1962, 90%. 1963 to 1972, 60%. 1973 to 1982, 59%. 1983 to 1992, 21%. 1993 to 2002, 42%. Medical descriptions of race. In 1952 to 1962, 0. 1963 to 1972, 15%. 1973 to 1982, 59%. 1983 to 1992, 46%. 1993 to 2002, 93%. The use of race in American and Chinese anthropological journals. American Psychological Anthropological Journals, articles that group people racially, 40%. Articles that don't group people racially, 60%. Chinese Physical Anthropological Journals, articles that group people racially, 100%. Articles that don't group people racially, 0%. Belief in race among anthropologists and biologists. Biologists, races are real, 70%. And biologists, races are not real, 16%. Physical anthropologists, 49% believe races are real. 41% believe races are not real. American and European physical anthropologists on the existence of race. American physical anthropologists, 31% believe races exist. 69% believe races don't exist. European physical anthropologists, 43% believe races exist. 53% believe races don't exist. Survey of European anthropologists on the existence of race. Races exist, total 50%. It breaks down by age. So on the races exist, for European anthropologists on the existence of race, 21 to 35-year-olds, 62% believe. 36 to 55-year-olds believe, 38% believe. 56 to 73, 61% believe. And then also Eastern Europeans, 69% believe the existence of race, and Western Europeans, 33% believe the existence of race. Races don't exist. 48% total do not believe races exist. And the age breakdown is 21 to 35, 38% don't believe races exist. 60% of people between the ages of European anthropologists between the ages of 36 and 55 believe races don't exist. That's 60%. And 37% of physical anthropologists in Europe between the ages of 56 and 73 don't believe races exist. So Eastern Europe, 30% believe races don't exist, and Western Europe, 66% believe races don't exist. And then it varies between 2 to 3% that don't know in general. A few things to know about these charts. Researchers outside of Western Europe are more likely to believe in race. Biologists are more likely than anthropologists to believe in race. Young researchers are more likely to believe in race than middle-aged ones, and the use of race in textbooks is increasing, suggesting that belief in race is on the rise in academia. The one place that has a consensus on race is China. That consensus is that race exists. There are no race genes. A race gene is a gene that is present in every member of one race and only members of that race. Such genes do not exist, and some people think that the non-existence of a race gene shows that races don't exist either. Obviously, this has nothing to do with the notion of race that I am advancing here. Races differ in gene frequency, but that does not imply that race genes exist. By the way, I don't know if any race realist in history has founded their concept of race on race genes prior to the 20th century. Races were almost always defined by where your ancestry came from and what your hair, face, skull, skin color, and general anatomy looked like. In the 20th century, race continued to be tied to ancestry, but the traits scientists used to infer ancestry changed from observable physical traits to gene frequencies. Race cannot be important because we all share 99% of our DNA. Following the Human Genome Project, many people heard that we share 99.9% of our DNA. So there just isn't enough genetic variation among humans to cause significant differences. First, we don't share 99% of our DNA. The Human Genome Project research made that claim has since redacted it, but we do probably share around 90%, 99% of our DNA. That said, we also share 95 to 98% of our DNA with chimps, and yet there are pretty big differences between us and chimps. The reason that a small percentage difference in DNA can lead to big differences is simple. A small percentage of a huge number can still be big, and genomes are huge. The human genome is made of 3 billion nucleotide base pairs. If you compare two people's genome, these base pairs won't match up roughly 0.5% of the time. 0.5 of 3 billion is 15 million base pairs. To put that in perspective, the difference between someone with or without sickle cell anemia, my God, I can't say that word, anemia is a single base pair. Sickle cell anemia, you know the word. In fact, the human species has a much more than has much or more total genetic variation than many other species of animals. I'm not going to read this whole article, this whole thing, but the breakdown of subspecies is jaguars have 9 recognized subspecies. African buffalo have 5 recognized subspecies. Chimpanzees have 4. Brown bears have 19. Polar bears have 1 recognized subspecies. The lynx has 3. African wild dogs have 5. Coyotes 19. Bighorn sheep 3. Leopards 13. Gray wolves 37. North American wolverines 2 to 3. Bonobos have 1. Brown bears have 19. Pumas have 6. Domesticated dogs have 1. Dingoes have 1. Elk have 8. And Wolverines, have werewolves. That'd be a different article. Wolverines have 3. And there's very low, the total genetic variation hovers below 0.5 to 0.3, all the way up to 0.7. Histrionically, the probability of 2 individuals will have different gene variants of the same gene. This difference is the 99.9 number, which refers to the base pairs, which are the building blocks of the genes. Human races are not genetically distinct enough. You may have heard that there is more genetic variation within the races than between, and so race must not be very biologically important. The first thing to say about this is human races are on par with subspecies in other species in terms of how much genetic variation is between them. So this graph shows species. So we'll start with humpback whales. Humpback whales, number of subspecies is 3. Genetic variation between the subspecies is about 12%. Plain zebras, 5. Genetic variation is 11%. Wildcats, 3. Genetic variation is 11%. Cobb is 3. Genetic variation is 11%. Southwestern European crow, 18 different breeds. Genetic variation is 6.8%. African buffalo is 5. Genetic variation is 5.9%. Canadian lynx, 3. Genetic variation is 3.3. Red-winged blackbirds is 5. Genetic variation is 1. Humans, well, some people say 0. And the genetic variation between the various subspecies of humans is 12. Secondly, we've already seen that genetic differences are significant to allow near-perfect prediction of a person's race based on their genome. Thirdly, the average genetic difference between members of separate races is larger than average. We've already seen that the average genetic difference between people is potentially very significant. There hasn't been enough time for the races to evolve differences. From an evolutionary perspective, the question isn't how long two populations have been separate, but rather how large the genetic difference between them are. And, as we've already seen, the genetic differences between the races is comparable to subspecies in other animals. How quickly these differences arose is irrelevant, but the argument is flawed on even simpler grounds. The time that the races have been separated is equal or larger to that of the amount of time it took for subspecies or even species themselves to evolve in other animals. Brown bears versus polar bears, the time it took to evolve separate species or subspecies, 10,000 years. Waterfowls, 10,000 years, or sorry, not 10,000, excuse me, 100,000. So brown bears versus polar bears, 100,000. Waterfowls, 100,000. Humans, 100,000. Moose, 100,000. Birds, 95,000. Tigers, 72,000. Discord birds, 70,000. Let's see what I call Cynopetria, 65,000. Wood ducks, 34,000. And lizards, 12,000. Human variation is continuous, not racial. It's continuous, not racial. Some people say that human genetic variation tends to change slowly and is a function of geography. For instance, as you move further from the equator, skin color tends to become lighter. The point of race denier is to make it so that this gradual change and variation doesn't have any quote-unquote hard lines that demarcate one race from the other. Instead, race blends into one another, and the genetic distance between populations is basically a function of their geographic distance. There are three things to say about this. First, scientists often group continuous variations into different discrete categories. Consider, for instance, medical researchers break continuous blood pressure variations into discrete categories such as high and low. Physicists group continuous variations across color spectrums into discrete colors such as blue and green. Social scientists break continuous variations in income into discrete categories such as rich and poor. Secondly, this is typical in biology. Zoologists even have a word for situations in which subspecies are connected by intermediate populations, intergraduation. Thirdly, human genetic variation is not, in fact, just like the color spectrum. Some race populations are more genetically similar than different race populations, even when all three populations are separated by the same geographical distance. More fundamentally, the problem with this argument is that it does not address the predictive or explanatory power of race. Even in genetic variation, which is totally continuous, we would still need to categorize it to make predictions rather than just say, oh, that guy, he's somewhere on the spectrum. And the degree that different sections of said spectrum experience different environments, evolution, cultures, interactions with others, racial categorization would still have explanatory power too. The traits that races are based on are arbitrary. This argument postulates that you could come up with mutually exclusive groupings of people based on different traits that, because there's no objective method of choosing which traits to use, which grouping you decide to go with is arbitrary. For instance, you could group people based on skin color, and as a result, Africans and certain groups of Indians might be grouped together. Or you could group people based on height, in which case Indians and Africans would most certainly not be grouped together. The problem with this argument is that racial categories are not arbitrary. We use them because they help us predict and explain human differences. We can think of other categories that are also useful for this purpose. Sure, so what? Sometimes it's useful to group people into racial categories. Sometimes it's better to use a different categorization scheme and something that is best to combine them, black and poor, diabetic. Genetic cluster analysis is worth bringing up here. In a genetic cluster analysis, you give a computer program information on a ton of people's DNA, and you tell them to sort the data into X number of groups called clusters, so that the genetic differences within each group clusters are minimized, while the genetic differences between clusters are maximized. When you do this and tell the computer to group human genetic variations into about 4 to 6 clusters, the clusters end up mirroring the races such that researchers can predict someone's race based on which cluster they are assigned to with 99 plus level of accuracy. Thus, races are groups of people who are more genetically similar than average. Consider next the behavioral geneticists have shown conclusively that more genetically similar people, excuse me, let me restart that. Consider next that behavioral geneticists have shown conclusively that the more genetically similar people are, the more alike they will tend to be in terms of just about every trait imaginable, from body size to intelligence to personality. Studies utilizing adoption, molecular genetic analysis, and unrelated individuals show that this is true even when the individual in question grows up in different families and in different environments. What this implies about race is that the members of the same race will not, excuse me, what this implies about race is that members of the same race will not only be more similar than average genetically, but will also tend to be more similar than average with respect to every trait that is heritable, which is all of them. Racial categories change across time and place. Race deniers sometimes argue that people in different places, or even Westerners just a few centuries ago, had racial difference had radically different, I'm erasing the brain, radically different ideas about who was a member of which race, and that because of that, race is invalid. I don't think this objection makes much sense. Who cares if people in other parts of the world or us a few centuries ago had different ideas about race? The question is whether or not the modern Western racial categorization schemes are valid scientific categories. That is, they can predict and can they explain. I feel like even if they couldn't, they'd still be valid, but that's what he's arguing. As we've seen, they can. Moreover, they can reflect the actual genetic clusters of the human races. So, what's the problem? Race deniers often exaggerate the extent to which Western racial ideas have changed over time. That isn't essential to this argument. How many races are there? Some people will rhetorically ask how many races are there. There is no one answer to this question. Some people think that this entails that races don't exist, but what it really does is nothing of the sort. Something I want to add in is that earlier when you talked about genetic clusters, that it's downplaying the similarities between groups and emphasizing the similarities with the outside groups. That's important to remember because, like within Africa, it's all Africans, right? All black people. There's a lot of genetic variation within blacks, and there's more genetic variation within blacks than there is between like blacks and whites, for example. But the problem is, and he might go into this in future articles, is that when you are talking about race colloquially, like within like public or about like a social issue, people aren't talking about that, right? They're talking about how many white people are in one area, how many black people are in one area. They're focusing on the difference, right, that is occurring between these groups, not necessarily all the genetic variation going on within the group. So that's why it's important when you're dealing with race and you're dealing with physically different people and the traits that are going to occur, like the genetic traits, the mental traits that are going to occur within that physical group that is visually different than another group. That's what you want to talk about, is emphasize those differences so you can separate them out into distinct categories and then gain predictive information about how those categories are going to behave in the future, like in job applications. And you can explain things genetically that people currently might have social explanations for. All right, just wanted to clear that up. Sometimes, given the level of information that we have and what we are trying to do, it can be useful to break humans into as few as 3 races or as many of a dozen. Sometimes we want to talk about whites, sometimes Northern Europeans, sometimes Celts. This isn't contradictory or hard to understand. It just reflects the fact that we need varying levels of specificity in different contexts. Specificity. Race is a social construct. At least we've reached the final argument. Oh my god, the final argument. Some people think that race cannot be a valid biological concept because it is socially constructed. My response to this, of course, it is socially constructed. That's like that's what I've been saying this whole time. Categories are tools in which we invent in order to predict and explain things. The fact that we can invent them tells us nothing about how well they do either of these two things. Now, some people will say that we invented racial categories for bad reasons, oppression, racism, etc. I don't think this matches the actual historical records of where racial categories came from, but even if it did, it still would be irrelevant. If the Nazis or the commies created something useful scientific information for evil reasons, would it still therefore be invalid? No, obviously not. Similarly, the intentions behind the creation of racial categories is irrelevant to the ability to explain and predict human differences. Conclusions. So, those are the common arguments I've always heard and why I don't think they work. Hopefully this article gave you something to think about. If you're still not convinced, I would honestly like to know why. And please leave a comment letting me know. You can no longer comment. I briefly DM'd Ryan Falk telling him that his website is down. He doesn't seem to care. But I think his stuff is very valuable, and I want to make sure people at least hear it. He did a lot of videos, and I might cover those in the future, but at least for the moment, I want to kind of cover his articles. And if they're not linked, I might go through some of these old links and try to update them, because I think he does a good job kind of citing his research and kind of going through the different genetic stuff. I'm going to go through another book that's a little more on the layman side so that we can kind of understand how genetics work and everything before we kind of dive into some of this more detailed stuff. But Ryan's stuff is a great beginning section, I guess, to kind of learn about this stuff. It's not kind of how I got into scientific racism or race is a scientific category, but I think for normal people it might be a good one. All right, that's all. That's Spencer McGreal.